I think it's just about time, though. My name's Mike Staten. I am a soybean educator with MSU Extension, and I'll be your host this morning on the virtual breakfast. So welcome, everyone. We've got a really good program lined up with Dr. Manni Singh and Jeff Andreessen. Dr. Singh is our assistant professor. He's our MSU cropping systems agronomist and has done a lot of work in corn and soybeans. Manni, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Mike. Welcome, everyone. Today, I thought to go over 3 key points that will set us up for a high yield potential as we're thinking about planting corn and soybeans over here. And I'll also try to compare and contrast corn and soybean as these 2 plants, they behave differently in terms of their response to management, as well as if we see any stresses out there. So to begin with, I'll start with what's probably on everyone's mind. What are the ideal field conditions for us to get started over here, right? So to me, that the number one and the most critical piece is the optimal soil moisture, because this is not only important for achieving a high yield potential for this year, but also any long-term implications, right? If we end up tilling or planting when the soil is relatively wet, what we call mudding the seed in, it can cause some of these issues in terms of poor seed to soil contact, non-ideal seed placement, sidewall compaction that can impact root growth for this year's crop, right? And limit our yield potential for this crop season. But then this can also lead to the soil compaction that is setting us up for a lower potential down the road, right? So we want to make sure that we are not planting in a non-ideal soil moisture conditions. In terms of what is too wet to plant, I have this graphic over here that sort of nicely explains, the window that's sort of shaded over here. That is a no work or traffic zone. And that pretty much depends on our soil texture, right? How much wet the soil or the soil moisture is gonna depend on our soil texture, as you can see over here. A good rule of thumb again is that dig a hole and then look at that soil at the planting depth, not at the surface, right? That's gonna behave differently. Go in that 1.5 to 2 inches deep and try to grab some soil from few spots. And if it deforms, then we are okay. But if it's just turning into a ball, that's not ideal. So keeping an eye on optimal soil moisture is really critical in the first piece of these 2 important aspects, right? And the second one is this optimal soil temperature. And again, the key here is the soil temperature, not the air temperature, right? Because the seed is in ground at this point, right? So making sure we are looking at soil and not air temperature is the key here. And we have had this rule of thumb, start planting only when it's 50 degrees and rising. I believe that threshold is lower now with the new genetics that we have. I believe breeders have done a good job in developing genetics that can deal with some of these lower temperatures, especially in case of soybeans. I believe the threshold is probably in mid 40s or so. But then the important piece here is again this rising, right? That's where the weather forecast come into play, and hopefully Jeff will have a good news for us over here. You can see last week we were already getting into the mid-high 40s in the southern part of the state, and as of Sunday last week, we were actually hitting upper 50s, which is very unique. I don't think I have seen that in the last few years here in Michigan. But again, the weather we have had over the last few days, I assume these temperatures have gone down a bit. Although soil has a buffering capacity, right, compared to the air temperature. But yeah, we need to again keep an eye on those. And what can happen if we are planting in non-ideal conditions, right? The number one factor is this imbibitional chilling injury. So those first 24 to 48 hours are really critical, right? If we have a weather forecast that's showing that can be a concern, holding on, planting is really critical. After that period, we might be relatively okay. But this first 24 hours in soybean and 48 or so in corn is really critical. Otherwise, it can lead to all sort of issues with the germination and emergence, right? And we need anywhere between 90 to 120 growing degree days for emergence to occur, right? So if the soils are relatively cool, it's gonna just take longer time, right? And lead to potentially uneven stand that will have implications, right? And it might differ between corn and soybean, but that can happen. And this picture sort of shows you, what's the benefit of planting corn and soybean early or on a timely fashion here in Michigan, as long as we are planting in these ideal soil conditions, as I just talked about, right? Over and over again, we see that when we are able to plant end of April, going into mid-May at the latest, we are developing this nice canopy that's intercepting sunlight relatively early in the growing season and potentially setting us up for a high yield potential compared to some of these late planted crops, right? Towards end of May, early June, where we can see that it's still not intercepting all of the sunlight, right? And again, we now have a lot of data where we are seeing that the planting date does impact yield in Michigan. If you go down in I states, it might be a little different, right? Because our growing season is different compared to what they have over there. We are relatively more northern, right, compared to most other production areas. So you will see a couple of charts over here that are showing the relative yield decline as the planting gets delayed, right? So I have shaded this comparing early versus mid versus late season. And a couple of points that we can think about looking at these data. Number one is you can see that with early planting, we have the highest yield potential, right? And that potential starts declining, not at a linear rate, right? We have seen those numbers, a bushel, 2 bushel decline in yield with every day delay of planting. That is not the case. The decline is relatively small, less than 0.5% or so in May. And then once we start getting into June, that's where the decline starts really at a steeper rate, 1% or even more than that. But even here, both for soybean and even for corn, you can see a couple of data points that are still sitting pretty nicely up here, right? So meaning a later planting does not always means lower yield, but at least we are not at the mercy of weather in terms of maximizing our yield potential. That if we plant early, that does give us a higher yield potential. You can see in 2022 here, we did lose yield potential at a lower rate compared to what happened in 2021, if you see this green dot down here. So again, meaning that there is an impact of planting time over here. If you go again too far in this early window over here, you can starting to see that not statistically, but numerically, we had a yield decline. So that's where optimal planting conditions are still very critical, right? We have also done some of this planting date work in soybeans. There's a lot of interest, right? A lot of you probably are thinking about planting soybeans early, a relatively new thinking, right? Compared to go ahead and plant corn first. And here you can see we have done more than 30 on-farm field trials, where more than half of our trials showed a yield benefit of 2 bushels or more by planting early. And I'm talking about end of April or so here, not ultra early, and seeing a yield benefit here compared to a typical planting of mid-May or so. But we have seen a yield penalty here as well, that when we planted early and the soil conditions were not ideal, we had a stand loss, and that can lead to yield declines, right? So something to be careful about. And that's where, again, we have to be thinking about this risk versus reward approach, so to speak, right? That as I just showed you, there are potential rewards of planting early, right? We can see a yield benefit and improved profitability because it doesn't cost us more money. If nothing else, we are seeing an extended planting window, right? So it's minimizing the risk of a delayed planting, right? So, and the yield loss that comes alongside. So at least we have that. But there are risks as well, right? The first one, again, is this issues with germination and emergence that can lead to a poor plant stand. Here you can see a soybean plant that did get frosted. But soybean plants have these, auxiliary buds. And here you can see two of them are starting to germinate. And you might actually have two branches on this plant and might be okay, right? But again, something to keep in mind as I talked before. And then there is a crop insurance coverage aspect to it as well, right? You can see the insurance dates over here. Typically starts again towards third or fourth week of April in south and move later as we go north. So again, thinking about the optimal planting window, again, my take home here is that we have to be thinking about field conditions and weather forecast and not think too much about the calendar, that it's that time of the year and we need to start planting, right? Last week was probably a good example, and we had really good conditions, but now the weather has turned a little bit downward. So we have to be careful. The optimal planting window we are seeing in our results is this end of April to mid-May. And it does move, right? As we go from south to central to northern Michigan, it's going to move a little bit later. But typically, again, for a lot of our areas, we are seeing that is the optimal time to plant. And again, planting in good conditions is really critical, as we have seen that if we plant in marginal conditions, it can result in a yield loss. And again, little later plantings can still result in a decent yield for us. There is this question always out there, right? What to plant first, corn or soybean? And to me, it comes back to the field conditions, right? We might need to be thinking, what are the fields that are candidates for early planting based on their soil texture, drainage, if we have residue there, tillage, no tillage, right? And making our decisions based on that. One aspect I want to emphasize over here is, again, equipment availability can be a concern too. And there is differences in terms of seed placement and its accuracy on how corn and soybean behaves. Corn does benefit more from a uniform seed placement and that uniform emergence in plant stand. Soybeans are more forgiving. So again, soybeans, we can go with the relatively less precise seed placement method and still able to plant early. Something to keep in mind. We have put together an article on this planting technologies, which is on our website. So that will provide you a lot more details on that topic. So again, moving on to that second point. Timely planting is critical, but what else do we need to be thinking in terms of changing other management, right? I showed you this curve before. How we can sort of change the trajectory of this curve, right, is what I'm thinking. How we can improve yield potential without putting too many inputs out there. And if we start thinking from a systems perspective, there's a lot of things we can do, right? Variety selection, what maturity to use, how to prepare seed bed, what planting method to use, what's the optimal seeding depth. So there's a long list that we can keep in mind that because some of those do change as we change our planting time. The one we'll look at here is the seeding rate piece of it, right? Because that's something on everyone's mind right now. How many seeds I drop to maximize my yield without putting too much cost to it, right? I have shown this figure, this image to probably you all before. Shows against this ability of soybean plant to compensate the plasticity of the plant, so to speak. As we go to relatively lower seeding rates, the plant is able to branch out and compensate for less number of plants per unit area, right? And that leads to this sort of relative plateau, what we call an exponential decline equation, where you can see after we reached somewhere around 60,000 plants or so, we reach this plateau and we sort of stay there. And it takes a lot of extra plants to go from 95 to 99% yield potential. So something again to keep in mind as I show you this data, where again these black bars are showing you the optimal seeding rate based on planting time. It hovers around 130 to 140,000 with the early planting, and then starts going up as we delay planting, right? But if we look at the seeding rate that maximizes your economic return, so accounting for seed cost, that number is quite a bit lower than what's maximizing our yield, right? Unless we go to the really late June planting dates. Another way of thinking this is splitting this into early, mid, and late season. And you can see for the early and mid season, we are dealing with a relatively high yield potential here, right? So soybeans, relatively high yield potential, we can go to a lower seeding rate. And as we go to the late season, the yield potential is low. So we probably need to push to a higher seeding rate, right? This is under conventional till. So if you're in no-till, that probably the numbers will go up a little bit. In terms of seeding rate in corn, this has been one of the main driver of our yield increase, right? Over our years. I think we are adding like anywhere around 250 plants per acre every year. And the number generally depends on the yield environment of the field. There are other factors, water availability, hybrid genetics, but generally, when I look at literature, you can see some data over here that based on our yield potential, the response, that curve I'm showing you over here changes, right? Generally in Michigan, we are dealing with this high yield environment, anywhere from 150 to 180 bushels, right? So here you can see a nice quadratic curve with a plateau around that 32 to 34,000 seeds per acre. And if we push more, it does come down. So unlike soybeans, something to be careful about, right? And again, these are number of plants. Target seed rate, probably 5 to 10% higher than that. That's for maximizing yield. If we're looking at economics, the number can be around 5% or so lower. So might come around to what I'm showing you over here. The number 3 and the last point I wanted to make here is, again, we don't want to go there, but we know things happen. And what do we think in terms of replanting decisions, right? That to me is very critical. And there is some, again, change in thinking over the years on this. As we all know, if we're dealing with the relatively poor stand, number 1 is go out and assess that stand and the health of that stand. If we see any injury on corn, the growing point is below ground until it reaches 5 or 6 leaf stage. So again, it might grow out of that injury we are seeing. Waiting for a few days before assessing stand is critical there, right? Number 2 is we want to look at the pattern of loss, right? Sort of distribution of plants that are left out in the field. And then sort of think about, what is our decision? Do we want to go for a replant that we typically think of, or this repair plant that I define as that you do not tear up the stand that's out there, you go and you interplant, so to speak, where there are gaps, or you do nothing. And the decision to me comes down to, again, which crop we are dealing with. As I said before, soybeans are more forgiving. If we are seeing relatively low stand in soybeans, and the threshold now, I believe, is around 60,000 plants or so per acre. If we are around that number, doing nothing might be our best case scenario, or go out and repair plant because the plant is able to recover, right? Corn is different. If we are seeing relatively low stand, we probably need to go and replant, and we need to destroy the plants that are out there. Otherwise, they will start competing with each other, right? So again, there are charts, tables out there that will show you the yield potential of the current stand and compared to the yield potential of your new stand, right? Because there is a delayed planting penalty there. So few things to keep in mind there. And we again have a fact sheet on this aspect as well that we can put a link in chat box that goes in more details about how to think about replanting, at least for soybeans. So to wrap it up again, optimal planting in Michigan is critical, but we want to make sure that we are not planting in marginal soil conditions because that can result in loss in yield potential this year and impacts over time as well. And then we need to be thinking about other management on top of planting time, right? And seeding rate is a good example of that I showed you over here. Based on our yield potential, the idea is how low we can go for soybeans, how high we can shoot for corn without, again, hitting that lower declining curve there, right? And replanting, again, something to keep in mind, looking at stand uniformity and thinking about this repair plant idea instead of replanting if we see issues in terms of stand issues in soybeans. And again, all of this information is available on our website, agronomy.msu.edu, that we can put in chat box. And I'll stop here and see if there are any questions I can answer.
Thank you, Manny. Excellent presentation. So I want to thank everyone for attending. It was really good presentations. And if you want to follow us on any of these 4 sites, please, we encourage you to do that. That would be the MSUE Field Crop site, Apple Podcast, Spotify, or you can follow on Facebook. So really appreciate you doing that. We also have a website you see listed there. So if you missed any part of this or want to revisit these presentations, you can do that via these methods. This is a time in the program where we answer questions. I'll go through the chat and read some of the questions that have been entered in there. We had one. This is from Stephanie. I'm a homesteader, so my corn plot is small. Compared to most, I am planting a 600 square foot plot and then using corn in the 3 sisters method. I have sweet, popcorn, and Indian corn. Is there one of those varieties that would do better in the 3 sisters plot or in my bigger, more dense 600 foot square plot?
Yeah. So, Mike, I have not done as much work on those corn types. We have started some work on the Indian corn, and again, I think if the question is relating to like how many seeds you want to put out, I think there's a lot of differences within these two, right? There's a lot of genetic differences, at least what we're finding out within Indian corn. The seeding rates are going to be much lower than what I showed you. I think they are in that 22 to 24,000 per acre ballpark, rather than more than 30 or 32,000. Which one is more competitive than the other? That I really don't know.
Purdue University has some more research on those kinds of topics, but if you're specifically looking for like the 3 sisters approach, I would turn to our universities that are tribe universities and look at their research. And so I'm not sure where you're from, but maybe seeing if you have a local tribal university running those kind of programs. Or I'm aware that like the Saginaw Chippewa Indian tribe, or some of them from our area do have extension like us, and they may be able to help you more with that question.
Yeah, but please do not follow the recommendations for a typical corn grain, right? Our dent corn recommendations, because they will be much different.
Good. Thank you, Manny. Thank you, Monica. Next question is, what impact does early planting have on weed emergence? So I don't know if that's more of a Aaron and Christy question, Manny, but.
Yeah, if one of them are on, I think that's probably better if they can answer that. I know Christy is doing some work on the soybean side, and Aaron probably is looking on the corn side. So let's see if any of them are on.
So yeah, this is Christy, and for early planting, some of the things that you're going to probably run into is you might see a little bit more of what we would consider winter annuals being more showing up, potentially more that you might have to manage. So we've done some early planting stuff. A lot of times we're doing some tillage or making sure that we have some burn down going on there. One other thing that'll probably happen, we're using some pre-emergence herbicides. If you're doing that, you're going to want to probably scout a little bit closer, maybe a little bit sooner as far as the size of the crop. So you might just see a little shift in some different weed species. So think of the ones that are going to come up early. Things like common lamb's quarters are probably going to be a little bit more of a problem. Some of your ragweed species that come up early. So just kind of keep an eye on those. But in general, we've been able to have very good control with, a 2-pass program. So whether it's planted early or at our normal planting time.
This is Chris here. I'm going to butt in because I was in a field yesterday being planted to corn, and there were already Asiatic garden beetle within the top 2 inches of the soil surface. So some of those pests, it's a niche pest in southern Michigan, but sometimes with early planting, with some of those early feeding pests, you could get more damage than if you planted a little bit later.
Good information, Christy and Chris. Thank you very much. There's another question here from Manny. It's there's a lot of information in the media talking about uniform emergence of corn for higher yield. Does planting depth change emergence for corn?
So planting depth, yes, planting depth will change, right? Time to emergence, because your again, as I was talking, the growing degree days, we're looking at the soil temperature at that time, and with the change in planting depth, those temperatures will change. So it will have some impact. But typically we do not recommend changing planting depth. If you are planting early or late, there is probably not too much benefit of going too shallow. So for corn, again, our recommendation generally is go to that 1 3/4 up to 2 inches, and then for soybeans around that inch and a half in that neighborhood. And because if you plant corn shallow, it will impact where your crown develops, and it does impact your root growth later. So planting shallow probably is not ideal in those conditions. Uniform emergence is critical for corn. What's the yield penalty with that? I think that number probably is sometimes we overestimate that number, but it is real, and we want to make sure that there is uniform emergence. And then we don't have like too much separation. So like if we have a plant that is V2 versus V4, V5, that's gonna have impacts for sure. So we want to make sure that we are chasing that consistent seeding depth when planting corn. Soybean is a different story. We have done some work now where it's showing that soybeans are more forgiving. Even if you get non-even emergence, if the plants are behind each other, they are more forgiving and they are able to compensate. So again, more critical to manage for optimal, consistent seeding depth using more precise seed placement technology in corn compared to soybeans.
Good. Thank you, Manny. I had a question about soybean seeding. Your work, I think, is done with planters, and there's a lot of growers that are still planting with air seeders or even box drills. So do we have to adjust our seeding rates, our soybean seeding rates, if we're using like lower technology seeders, single disc openers, single closing wheels type of things?
Yeah, so that's a good question. The numbers I was showing you, they are based on a planter, so a more precise seed placement method, right? So we actually are starting to look at some work, as I was saying before, we are seeing a less benefit of a more precise seed placement in case of soybeans. And we have a really good fact sheet. I think there's a link in chat box. It's on our website. If you go to extension soybeans, you will find a really detailed article on that. In terms of do we need to increase the seeding rate if we are using a less precise seed technology, I think physiologically you might not benefit from that until we are dealing with a relatively really low seeding rates, right? If we are down in like around 100K seed rate or so, that's maybe where we might see a potential benefit of going to a higher seeding rate using a less precise method. But I think it's more probably just as an insurance policy, just to have, it comes down to how much risk I want to take, right? I believe you won't get a yield benefit just by pushing to a higher seeding rate. But if you're dealing with these non-ideal conditions, if you have a low spot in the field somewhere where you will have a higher loss in germination emergence, those are the scenarios where probably going to a little higher seeding rate when you're using a less precise technology will benefit. But again, I think just like what we recommend, even if you're using a planter, wherever you are, cut down your seeding rate by 10, 20%, throw a couple of strips out there and see what that does in your field dealing with your yield limiting factors, right? I think that to me is the best way to really know, okay, how low I can go.
That's good advice. Rather than jumping right to the 100,000 that you shows as your most economical rate, work your way down there instead of jumping to that.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a good recommendation, Manny. I appreciate that. Where do you think, Manny, I've tried to do this and I haven't been very successful in my role as a soybean educator, but trying to estimate what the statewide average is for soybean planting rate. What do you think? Where do you think we're at?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I have tried to find the answer to that, and I think probably the best information I had came from the service you had as part of that benchmarking project, right? I think we were around 150K, if I remember correctly. We are doing this new project where we are asking for more information from growers. we have had some success this year. So I think we were asking this question. We haven't looked at the data. I hope we are a little lower than that. I think some folks I've talked to, they are down to that 130, 140K rate. And that to me is pretty good. You know, again, I think sort of our gold standard has been 100,000 plants at the end of the day. That's what you want before you harvest, right? How to get there depends. That's where even the variable rate seeding comes into play, right? Different areas of the field might need different seeding rate to get to that 100K. It probably is lower than that, but yeah, I think yeah. Coming back to your question, I hope we are lower than that, but a lot of people I've talked to, I think, have cut it down to, I think 120K, I believe, is the lowest I have heard.
David actually entered into the chat. He's saying 120,000. David, I'm curious, is that the average? Is that your perspective for the state average, or is that what you're dropping on your farm?
Yeah, that's what he's dropping here.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was going to guess maybe 140,000 as our state average is kind of where I would guess. And but I think we've made a lot of progress. So and just something
we got to be careful, not cut it down too much, right? Again, it comes down to, again, how much risk someone is willing to take again. But there is a potential compared to where we were 6-7 years ago when you did that survey. There was a potential to cut them down, and I think we are on the right path here. So that's good.
And what's interesting is that Manni's data really matches our strip trials, 7 years, 67 trials across the state looking at planting rates. And we showed the 100,000, dropping 100,000 as the optimal and most economic seeding rate. So for soybeans. So it's interesting how the small plot research and the strip trials did match each other so closely. So I think that's pretty cool. It looks like there might have been a couple other messages. No, I'm not seeing anything.
Yeah, there is one on someone needing a soft copy of the presentation. I think if they give us their email ID or something, I can even send the slides, both I and Jeff. Or again, the whole talk will be posted on MSUE website, right, Mike?
Yes,
but it won't have the actual presentation deck in there. So if you want a soft copy, you can go to our website. I think a lot of this information is on the website I mentioned, agronomy.msu.edu, or you can email me and I can send you a copy of the slides too.
Thank you very much, Manny. Thank you again, Jeff. Is there any other specialists that have any comments that you want to make? I know I really appreciated Chris Stefanzo's comments. Is there any other specialists that want to give us an update about their perspective, specialty or crop? Are there any other questions from the audience? You know, you can either type them in, or at this time, if you're on the phone, you could just call it in.
Isn't it true what you're trying to achieve is a stand of soybeans of approximately 80,000? And so your conditions would dictate the amount of seeds you're dropping. If you have clay soil versus sandy soil, if it's wetter, if it's drier, how the forecast for rain is such, what equipment you're using.
Yeah, that's a good comment, Clay. So again, I think you're using the number 80,000. So what I was referring to before, the standard we have been using was across most universities was 100K, but I believe that number is lower. So again, if you're willing to take a little more risk, and I think one definitely can, 80,000 probably is maybe a new gold standard, if you will. So how much again you're gonna drop does come back to some of these field conditions, and that's where, to me, variable rate seeding even comes into equation, right? How many you need to drop will vary based on some of the field conditions. If you have a pocket in the field, that's different than what else is out there. But our data, my small plot data, is generally in more uniform conditions. I think maybe Mike can comment on that, because a lot of the strip trials he was doing, I assume, were across differing field conditions, different equipments, differing even tillage scenarios. And I think for the most part, the number that was jumping out was that 100K to 120K, I believe that's what you had, Mike, or 130, right?
Yeah, 100 was actually the most dropping. 100,000 was actually our most profitable. 130 was second, 80,000 was actually third, and the least profitable was dropping 160,000 across all of our trials. But there is something else, Clay and Manny, and I've posted this in some articles, and I'll try to find this, but University of Illinois, Manny's colleague over there, Emerson Knopfsinger, put together a really good planting rate guide for soybeans. And what it does is it considers both factors that really affect your seeding rate and your final stand. And the two factors are, of course, your germination that's in the bag or in the pro box. What is the germination of the seed? The second factor is the emergence. And Emerson really put this together, and you kind of estimate, you know, what your germination score is, what your emergence score is going to be, and it tells you how many seeds, and then it tells you what you want to end up with, and it tells you how many seeds you need to drop to end up with that desired planting rate or harvest rate. So it's pretty good. I'll see if I can find that, and I'll have it available for next week.
But again, I think the idea with soybeans is that they are relatively more forgiving, right? The
Yes.
indeterminate types we are using for the most part here, they're able to branch out, right? So we can easily overthink, I would say, so to speak. We can overcomplicate, while I think in soybeans, it's probably not as critical of a decision point, as long as we are not below some threshold. And a relative uniformity of that stand is critical. We don't want to see those big holes, right? Corn is very different. We need to be probably more honed in, you know, because it depends. If we push too high or if we're too low, the curve is really steep, relatively steep at that high end. Soybeans have this relatively long plateau, right? So a lot of this comes back to, again, how much risk you are willing to take to cut it down, right? And there's no penalty, so to speak, other than, you know, putting more cost as you go a little higher.
Excellent discussion, excellent questions, excellent answers, Manny. And Jeff, thank you so much for your presentations. It is time to wrap up. I see there was one last comment, is we do need to consider crusting when we lower our seeding rates in clay soil. So I thought that was pretty good, but thanks for joining us. I really appreciate the interaction, but it is time to sign off.